This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Okay, right, well, to anyone who's just joined us, just like to say very pleased to welcome you to the Institute of Philosophy. Also very pleased to welcome Simon Blackburn. Simon is Emeritus Professor at the University of Cambridge and also a part-time Distinguished Research Professor at the University of North Carolina. His books, some of which are on the table over there, include, among others, Ruling Passions, Think, Being Good, and recently Practical Tortoise Raising, which is a collection of essays. Simon also wrote How to Read Hume, but today he's going to be talking to us about Misunderstanding Hume, the case of practical reason.
Thank you very much, Emily, and thanks everybody for turning up. I gather that I'm speaking at exactly the same time as the redoubtable John McDowell, so I feel very honoured to get any kind of audience. I'll try and tell a joke or two, and that will remind you which person you're listening to. Okay, I'm going to, this is I ought to apologise. I've used this occasion as an excuse for running through a paper that I had to write for the forthcoming Oxford Handbook on Hume, and so it's rather in the guise of a sort of run through of a lot of things rather than a detailed concentration on just one thing. But I'll try and concentrate where concentration is called for. I think in order to understand Hume on practical reason, we first of all need to understand his view on the explanation of action. I think that's widely misunderstood. It's misunderstood in there are two different levels of misunderstanding. I think one is just enemies of Hume who think they know what he said and it's simple and it's simply wrong. But other than that, they're quite detailed exegeses in the, for example, the Hume Society literature and Hume studies, a lot of which make it very, very complex and difficult. And I think it's very, very simple and straightforward, and that Hume is actually right. So that's the first item on the agenda. Okay, so off we go. And now, many commentators, everyone, points out that Hume really has no a priori right to lay down principles about what causes what. The direct opposite is famously one of the non-negotiable principles of his empiricism, and he actually says, Treatise 1.3.15, anything may produce anything, creation, annihilation, motion, reason, volition. All these may arise from one another or from any other object we can imagine. And yet, of course, it might appear that he's offering an argument in Treatise 2.3.3, that is, of the influencing motives of the will, precisely denying that reason alone can cause volition, and yet that's one of the very examples that he gave earlier on in the treatise. And the contradiction would, of course, be blatant, but it only arises from the thought that his claim cannot be empirical. And that in turn might seem forced on him because, of course, on the face of it, there are endless cases where beliefs cause passions or actions, where thinking things through cause beliefs, and in general where it's natural to think that rationative or cognitive activity controls and directs practical decision-making. And Hume gives examples. Thought of imminent pain typically triggers fear, the awareness of someone's suffering typically causes distress, and merely reflecting on sex suffices to excite the appetite. Lucky Hume. However, there's no need to make heavy weather of any of this, because Hume's evidence can indeed be empirical, and I think it is. So let us concede that reasonings, cognitions, beliefs, and reflections do affect passion and action. The question is whether they do so alone. And this is a word which is inexplicably missed out from many people's discussions, and yet at the beginning of the influencing motives of the will, I shall endeavour to prove first that reason alone can never be a motive to any action of the will, reason alone. A bit later, I believe it scarce will be asserted that the first species of reasoning alone is ever the cause of any action. a bit later, it is not of themselves that mathematics has any influence on mathematical results. So the whole emphasis is on whether reason alone does one thing or another. And Aristotle, for example, denied that reason alone causes passions or actions. Here's from De Anima. Understanding evidently does not move anything without desire, for wish is a desire, and when movement is in accord with calculation, it is in accord with wish. It's Aristotle, not Hume. So you've got a tradition, as it were, of denying that reason alone, or cognition alone, or ratiocinative activity alone causes passion or action or motivation. Well, why might Hume have wanted to deny that it does? Well, presumably because, and this is an empirical observation, alongside causation, there's endless variation, where the same calculation, or the same perceptions, or the same causal inferences or beliefs generate very different results in different subjects, or in the same subject at different times. Where there's such variation, Hume thinks it's wrong, strictly speaking, to select just one element in a causal field as the cause. That's the third of his rules, whereby to judge of cause and effect. Instead, there'll be factors responsible for it. Quote, philosophers form a maxim that the connection betwixt all causes and effect is equally necessary, and that its seeming uncertainty in some instances proceeds from the secret opposition of contrary causes. Well, folk psychology and psychological theory alike put these differences down to intervening theoretical variables, and that's how desires, inclinations, temperament, values, emotions, and passions can generally take their place in the explanatory story of human choice. Okay, so that's the first point, I think. Aristotle also says, actually, that all theoretical understanding never contemplates what is done in action and says nothing about what is to be avoided or pursued. That's also from De Anima 3.9. Okay, and obviously as children we become virtuoso at learning about human differences and similarities and change and speed limits to change in respect of the passions. Okay. Well, and it's also said in the literature, that's how we read Hume. His point is trivial or tautological. Given that the passions need have no phenomenology, implied by the category of calm passions, they simply become shadows cast by our explanatory practices. So it's said, for example, Nagel says, is he simply postulating something we know not what to fill the gap between whatever reason supplies and whatever action or choice ensues, telling us, as I think Bernard Williams once put it, that only motives motivate. Ho, ho, ho. Well, that accusation simply relies on bad philosophy of science. You might as well charge that Newton simply postulates mass as something we know not what to fill the gap between applied force and ensuing acceleration, or postulates force as something we know not what to fill the gap between mass and acceleration, and then announce triumphantly that Newton's laws of motion are vacuous. The point overlooked is that these intervening variables have both a high degree of constancy and many theoretical liaisons, and thus create the web of theory that enables us to know what to expect and how to control the order of events. If someone's route from cognition to action seems to suggest, for example, a love of music one day, you might reasonably expect the same another day. Human beings are, of course, more variable than simple natural systems, but the principles are exactly the same. Your love of music indeed fills the gap between your hearing a concert announced and you buying a ticket, but it also enables me to predict what you're likely to do next time round, enables me to intervene to bring you pleasure, and so on and so on. As it stands, Hume's claim seems to depend on the division between cognition and other world-directing states of mind, passions or motives. And it might be suggested that in our actual psychology, the distinction becomes blurred, primarily by those perceptions that carry affect with them. And the examples that are frequently trotted out are the perception that somebody needs comforting, for example, or just the perception that something has to be done. The phenomenology, I think, is interesting enough, and indeed this touches on the last two talks about beauty and about causation. it's not poised to undermine Hume's point, since the affective perception is presumably not itself a function of pure cognition, or you'd have to argue that it was, and that's going to be very difficult. It has blended cognition with affect, so it is itself the result of contingent profiles of concern and desire. And again, variation gives us very good reason for saying that. Affective perceptions are variable. In another season, as desires shift, the clothes that were simply impossible start to look quite nice. And again, it's useful to notice that the parallel point arises, as Helen was reminding us, with the phenomenology of causal perception, where a readiness to make an inference plays the role of a feeling that is capable of determining how we see things, see them as causally connected. Although I think all this has been plain sailing, it leaves a deep and interesting residual question. Is it then contingent that we need both the cognitive and the conative in these explanations? Or is this, as John McDowell called it, a relic of 18th century psychology? Well, could there be a race of super-rational creatures who can get by with just one? There could certainly be creatures in whom there's much less variation in the route from cognition to action. But it might be a priori that for any creatures susceptible of even quite primitive versions of psychological explanation, it's necessary to distinguish the world-guided part from the world-guiding or goal-seeking part. I think the best explanation of this in the literature by far, and although it was eclipsed by Ruth Millikan's work, is Jonathan Bennett, the first two chapters of Linguistic Explanation, which I commend to all of you. Bennett showed in detail how any theory of explanation of action will see it in terms of identifying first a creature's goals, and then secondly its registrations of aspects of the environment. It being only these together that provide an explanatory and predictive theory of what it will do. Otherwise, it seems a priori then, according to Bennett, that we need elements with each direction of fit. And the rationale for thinking that is that we wouldn't actually need or have a psychological theory at all for any imagined super-rational creatures for whom there is no evidence of goals, variation in goals, and variation in means taken to achieve goals. They'd be much more simply describable in pure stimulus response or causal terms. Not superbly minded, but not minded at all. Not acting especially rationally, but merely moving, not acting. Now, Hume, of course, can't be directly credited with anticipating that thought. If he had anticipated, he wouldn't be there to say that reason could cause volition a priori, because reason alone couldn't cause volition a priori. Then that's right, we can say a priori that it couldn't. But it's significant, I think, that what he says chimes in so well with it. He's very sure that the empirical science is going to fall out, as he says. And I think Bennett's development excuses that uncertainty. Okay, so that's the first point I wanted to make about explanation. I now turn to the offensive against rationalism. As I said, I apologise for this being a little bit of a cook's tour through parts of Book 2 and Book 3 of the treatise. Hume is quite commonly described as a skeptic about practical... Oh, let me just go back to what I said about perception and the infusion of perception and affect. I think Mark Johnson has written and calls it the affective perceptions. So let's take the perception somebody needs something, or the perception that some clothes are simply impossible. It's interesting that, for example, Iris Murdoch, who is often credited with being a big influence on John McDowell and says some very similar things to him, she talks about just and loving attention as being sort of the key to ethics. So you've got to pay just and loving attention to what people are like and what the situation is and so on. And I think that's absolutely fine, but it's not anti-Humean. It's not making a point in favour of a purely cognitive etiology for whatever your just and loving attention gives you. It's a loving attention, it's got affect or passion involved in it. If you just said, oh, pay attention, sure, you might get cognitions, but you wouldn't get ethics out of it unless you imported them from somewhere else. Okay. Right, the offensive against rationalism. Hume is quite commonly described as a skeptic about practical reason, especially by those philosophers who think that's a very bad thing to be. Nagel, Korsgaard, Milgram, so on. Those who don't accept the charge are more apt to describe him, of course, as a naturalist, a psychologist, primarily concerned to describe the things that actually move us. I'm quite happy, of course, to bestow admiration on some of those or express aversion to others. The standards for his admiration or aversion, of course, derive from his views about whether any particular trait is useful or agreeable to ourselves or others. Okay, Hume wields those standards very seriously. There's nothing at all sceptical about his commitments to them and to the judgments they support. So it would seem natural to say, well, he gives his own account of what practical reasoning is and why it's so important. And for that reason alone, it's misleading to describe him as a skeptic about it. He may be skeptic about a particular version of practical reasoning or a philosophical account of practical reasoning. But unless it's evident that that version or account is compulsory, that's not the same thing. It was actually borne in on me today, this is not in my written paper, but I'll just mention it a bit, that there may be an explanation for why people like Korsgaard or Milgram think as they do, Nagel even, deriving from Kenny's misreading of Book 2 of the treatise, which would be that if you think that Hume is incapable of any account of intentionality at all, that is, if you think that, according to Hume, you can't, for example, think that it's raining outside, then of course we're going to deny him the capacity to think that, oh, because it's raining outside, I'll take an umbrella, and that seems to deny him any account of practical reasoning. So you might say, well, in Hume's world there's no such thing as practical reasoning. But that, of course, derives from a complete misunderstanding of Book 2, at least, in which objects of the passions become very salient and are given their own account. The idea that Hume can't look out the window and think it's raining, I better carry an umbrella, is just the result of an absurd misreading, I think. Hume was obviously sceptical about the versions of practical reasoning offered by the rationalists of his day, Malebranche, Wollaston, John Locke, Samuel Clarke. He refers us to the first appendix of the Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals for his own rebuttal. He would also, I'm sure, have been sceptical about the existence of pure practical reason in the form in which it was later invented by Kant. So here's why he might have been. Let us call a conative standpoint, one that's occupied by people not merely insofar as they're capable of agency informed by cognition and inference, but just insofar as in addition they have some particular desire, aim, inclination, motive, concern or feeling. Then I take it the Kantian holds that there are imperatives of reason, such as confining your maxims to those that pass the categorical imperative test, that can be known to be compulsory, either without any assistance of conation, or equivalently from any conative standpoint whatever. And Hume, I think, could have believed in no such thing. The discussion of the artificial virtues in the treatise, and the combination of indirect consequentialism and virtue theory in the second inquiry, show that for Hume principles have to earn their living, as it were. Then they have to earn their living by being conducive to things that we value. In turn, to see things as valuable is a function of the passionate profiles of our nature, and so it is only because of these that we see principles themselves as ever compulsory. We do so only when they build the vault within which we shelter, to use the lovely image from the appendix to the inquiry. Were they generally not to guide us, we would lose the chance of things we value, such as cooperation, security and trust. Their absence would throw us into ruin and misery, and it's the aversion to those that drive us. Hume would doubtless have agreed with Mill that Kant's attempt to prove otherwise is a grotesque failure. The derivation of the formula of universal law only shows that the worlds of the universalized maxim are not such as you would choose on other grounds you care about, such as utility. Otherwise, there's plenty of examples of things which you can't universalize, but which are perfectly okay and indeed desirable. A nice example would be, for example, acting on the maxim that I take it people like John Stewart and Stephen Colbert act on, which is to excoriate Republican fantastical political thinking wherever you came across it. Well, if everybody acted on the maxim of excoriating Republican fantastical political thinking whenever you come across it, there wouldn't be any people to think like that. And the way of acting that Colbert adopts would be unavailable. But that would be a better world, not a worse one, and so on. So these are familiar objections. Contemporary proponents of rationality as a self-propelling faculty, needing no assistance from the passions, tend to suppose that Hume or Humeans must think that our desires or feelings are themselves our reasons for acting. I think that started with Nagel. Again, it might derive from the belief that Hume has no intentionality in his system, in which case our desires or feelings are themselves our reasons for acting. And that can quickly translate, for example, into it being impossible that other people's desires or feelings are ever reasons for me. The idea being that since my whole motivational tank is, as it were, full of my own desires and feelings, then I've got no room to take any account of yours. And then Hume can be portrayed as a sort of solipsist and, in fact, a moral imbecile. And that move is, of course, wholly misguided for several reasons. First, there's the old point from Butler, which Hume repeats, my own desires might and often should include a concern that your desires and feelings are gratified. But secondly, of course, my own passions are typically not reasons. They're the matrix within which other things become my reasons. And this has been said by Pettit and Smith and myself and no doubt many others. I'm very fond of quoting Augustine here. Augustine says that in the pull of the will and of love appears the worth of everything to be sought or avoided, to be thought of greater or lesser value. He's not saying that the pull is itself a reason for anything. He's saying that in the light of the pull, or because of the pull, or in the perspective afforded by the pull, the features of the case are made into our reasons for action and preference. In just the same vein, Aristotle said that a person's character controls how the end appears to him. That's from the Nicomachean Ethics. So given the Humean ubiquity of sympathy in our characters, these other features will, of course, include what we take to be the desires and feelings of other people, at least when all goes well. Since rationalists and intuitionists remain innocently silent about why or when normative reasons, as they like to call them, actually influence us, they might do well to adopt Augustine's model, or Aristotle, or Hume's. And even Kant might, insofar as there's one thing to know that an imperative is compulsory, but another distinct thing to feel compelled by it. So we certainly have rationalism about which Hume might have been sceptical. But those who think that something's gone badly wrong fear more than that. And of course the notorious texts include the one we've already heard about today, it's not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world, scratching my little finger, and, well, I've got some others too, but I'll go past those. The point that's forgotten here is the context of those discussions, the context of 331 and 233, are entirely heavy-duty anatomical studies. It's Hume here being the psychologist, the analyst of the mind. So reasonable here means issuing from reason, that is, our cognitive and inferential powers alone, or in other words, regardless of cognitive standpoint. Seeing us as motivated solely by it would demand the rigidity that I have already said Hume is wise to avoid. Similarly, when Hume says provocatively that it is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to scratching my little finger, he's not denying that such a preference would be, then take your own list of pejorative terms, absurd, immoderate, appalling, insane, inhumane, and ridiculous. He's just denying one explanation, firstly of why we do not have such a preference, and secondly of why we find it so appalling, in order to make room for his own explanation, both of why we don't prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of our little finger, and why we would find that preference so appalling. I'd now like to talk briefly about the notorious argument for his position that Hume offers in 233. He thinks reason cannot alone produce passions, as we have seen, but neither can it stand in logical relations to them, such as, for instance, contradicting them. And his argument for this has been much criticised. Again, it's part of, I think, the train of thought which leads to denying him real intentionality. He says a passion is an original existence, or if you will, a modification of existence, and contains not any representative quality which renders it a copy of any other existence or modification. When I am angry, I am actually possessed with the passion, and in that emotion have no more a reference to any other object than when I am thirsty or sick or more than 5 foot high. And that might sound like a direct denial of intentionality, of intentional relations. It's impossible, therefore, that this passion can be opposed by or contradictory to truth and reason, etc., etc. And of course, it's tempting to protest that the passions have intentional objects, and that their fit with these things may be appropriate or inappropriate, and that opens up a field, it's alleged, within which reason can be deployed. Well, I think the response again should be that while a passion such as fear might indeed have a particular object, and while we may indeed make judgments about whether it's appropriate to that object, it doesn't follow, and it may not be true, and I don't think it is true, that either the fear itself nor our onlooking judgments are the progeny of reason alone. The arachnophobe is terrified at the spider in the bath. The entomologist is not. Neither does he think that the spider is an appropriate object of fear. But Hume is correct that the fear itself doesn't have to be thought of as a state of mind representing any fact about the spider, not even its being dangerous, although it may be responsible for perceptions that are saturated with affect, as described. The arachnophobe may wrongly believe that the spider is dangerous, but a fear might coincide with knowledge that it's not. It may merely be the sight of it that triggers the panic. And Hume describes cases in which imagination can trigger fear quite as effectively as belief. And conversely, of course, mountaineers might know that mountains are dangerous and dangerous to themselves, but the intrepid ones carry on happily unafraid. The final canard which has gained some currency is not so extreme as the view that Hume permits no practical reasoning. It holds instead that he can only admit means-end practical reasoning or hypothetical imperatives, where the end is given and we argue about the means. On the face of it, that's simply untrue. Hume joins the classical tradition in trying to persuade us of the value of certain ends in life, and the false pleasures that we wrongly imagine to attach to other ends that we set for ourselves, such as the amassing of wealth. He hymns the life of tranquility, the pleasures of the well-stocked and well-practiced mind, quotes, cultivating that higher and more refined taste which enables us to judge of the characters of men, of compositions of genius, and of the productions of the nobler arts, in the essays. And he also tries to hymn preach against the trumpery nature of other ends, as I say. Well, you might try arguing that such reasoning must, in accordance with his own view, activate some passion to move us, and that can always be represented as a means to satisfying whatever desire is involved in that passion. But that falsely supposes that Hume's passions are only desires, whereas of course he's explicit that many other states of mind count as passions. So consider, for instance, an example of shame. Suppose I believe I've made a fool of myself in some context, and I'm flustered and miserable and don't quite know what to do about it. Various course of actions suggest themselves, perhaps. I could write an apologetic note. I promise you this is not autobiographical. I could write an apologetic note, or send some flowers, or pretend that nothing happened, or find an excuse, or hope that everyone present will just forget it, try and distract them. I'm not sure what to do. There may be a neater solution, but rack my brains as I can, I don't find it. Well, that's quite different from having an end and seeking means to it. In such a case, my will is already directed, but in my bewilderment and dithering, it's not directed. You might suggest that I've got the end of ridding myself of the shame, but that isn't an end of mine. It's not my shame that's my problem, but my previous behaviour. Perhaps slightly obsessively, I'm trying to find a course of action that enables me to regain my stature in the minds of people who are present. And that's done by bringing possibilities to mind and accepting them or rejecting them in the light of my temperaments, beliefs, or feelings about them. I see no reason for Hume to deny the phenomena or to describe it differently. If you say, oh no, that really is means end, I can find the end is to do with this reparation project, and so it is means ends reasoning, then maybe everybody thinks that all practical reasoning is means ends reasoning, because the interpretation is going to be equally possible for other people as well as Hume. There's a related charge that Hume can't even certify the irrationality of failing to take known means to genuinely intended ends. This is, I think, often used as a Trojan horse. In fact, the book that we were kindly introduced to, that's over there at a very moderate price, Practical Tortoise Raising, the lead essay is partly about this. Now, of course, it's very difficult to make out just what the norm is here. Not taking known means to a genuinely intended end. There's states of certainly of paralysis, vacillation, irresolution, depression, self-doubt, inertia, which on occasion may be unfortunate, but any of which may in a given context be a thoroughly good thing. Perhaps even the work of an on-board guardian angel saving you from yourself. You tend to go down to the casino, you know that the first thing you've got to do to get entry to the casino and have an evening there is to go to the bank, but you just find yourself always walking past the bank. Jolly lucky. Your guardian angel is up there helping. Kant himself sometimes pronounces it to be analytic, that if you fully will the end, then you also will the known necessary means, in which case there's no space for a norm to be needed or to apply. In other words, while there are norms of rationality and they can be broken, it's much more doubtful whether this is one, for failures here typically force reinterpretation. If you find you're not taking what you must know to be the necessary steps, then we no longer know where you stand on the end. The only norm in the case that I can see is that from the standpoint of desire for the end, the subject failing to take the means is doing the wrong thing. There's some quite interesting logic to be done about knowing the necessary means to an end. And you get things equivalent to the paradox of the preface. So suppose I intend to lose weight, and I know that a necessary means is to eat less. I can nevertheless rightly hold that on each occasion of a meal, it's not necessary to eat less just now. So my behaviour is consistent with fully intending to lose weight. That's not a case of flouting any means-end principle on any individual occasion. So I think there is a paradox there, parallel to the paradox of the preface. I think quite a lot of cases which people like to cite as cases where people don't take known means to necessary means to known ends and to intended ends. Quite a lot of cases that look plausible are cases like that, where it's actually not true that the individual occasion is a case of not taking the necessary means to a known end, although of course in the aggregate they are. Okay, reasonable people. It's very important, I said that both 233 and 311, the two big passages about reason, are Hume operating as an anatomist. And of course it's very clear that he doesn't deny himself ordinary vernacular uses of words like reason. Very seldom uses the word rational, except in the context of rational animal, which is a distinction of a different kind. But reasonable is one of his favourite words. He's an 18th century writer after all. And he talks freely of reasonable people, reasonable plans, desires, precautions, policies, or inclinations. allowing himself, of course, all the senses that the OED offers, having sound judgment, sensible, sane, not asking too much, moderate in demand or amount, not absurd or ridiculous. So actually, he needn't have made his anatomical points by putting the word reason so much in the centre. And of course, he might have avoided a good deal of misunderstanding had he not done so, but I thought Stuart this morning very rightly pointed out that there's a tremendous element of mischief in Hume, and I think he just enjoyed inverting the classical tradition or the classical hierarchy, you know, urinating on Plato's model of the soul as the chariot with reason, the charioteer, and so on. But the important point about the will and morality is that cognizing the relation of ideas, i.e. making correct logical and mathematical inferences, and exercising causal and inductive habits on the data of the senses, those together, even when they're acting in concert, do not themselves suffice to explain actions. And that's a point which can be made, as I just made it, without involving any conception of reason, and yet it contains the essence of Hume's view. Revisiting the person who prefers his own acknowledged lesser good to his greater, Hume the moralist can perfectly well describe him as unreasonable, just as he can see the erection of the vaults of principle and justice as exercises of reason, that is, as deployments of admirable human traits such as foresight, prudence and cooperation. So with this hat on that he says in the history, quote, "Whatever we may imagine concerning the usual truth and sincerity of men who live in a rude and barbarous state, there is much more falsehood and even perjury among them than among civilized nations. Virtue, which is nothing but a more enlarged and more cultivated reason, never flourishes to any degree nor is founded on steady principles of honour, except where a good education becomes general, and when men are taught the pernicious consequences of vice, treachery, and immorality." So reason is there, simply taking its place as a faculty which, as it were, generates moral, helps to generate moral natures, our moral temperaments, our moral conventions. When our humanity condemns traits of mind, then if we so choose, the word unreasonable is at hand. Although in my view, other words that name their vice are both stronger and more precise. Okay. It's very hard to read much of the literature for the last 40 years, I suppose, from Murdoch in 1970, Nagel, same date, to Parfit last year, without fearing that some kind of fog has drifted over the whole landscape of moral philosophy. Multitudes of writers feel that they see normativity deep in the recesses of things, and while in our minds there live not only desires and other passions and concerns and aversions, but something greater, some perception of the Son, with the authority to stamp some desires, but possibly not others, as the darling creatures of reason. And when writers feel they can do that, they then excoriate Hume for not having done the same. But I know of no argument at all suggesting that the extra that they're bringing to the table is more than an illusion. And I think that in its political and social effects, it's a very dangerous one, because if you condemn the people you don't like to being irrational, you're basically saying that they're out of the conversation, that discursive pressure is not any more the correct political response to them. So it's I think it's one of the few occasions on which I disagree with Hume. I think that this is an error in philosophy which is dangerous. It's like errors in religion. I'm going to conclude by talking a tiny bit about value and morality. Some of this repeats a paper I published in Hume Studies a long time ago called Hume on the Mezzanine Level. But since this is an encyclopedia article, I've got to repeat it. I think a remark of the historian Margaret Wilson is very illuminating when we think about Hume either on causation or on taste, as we heard from Mike, or on value. Talking in general of philosophers of the 17th century, Margaret Wilson said, and she was including Galileo, Descartes, Hobbes, Boyle, Malebranche, you name it, she said, "Common to most of these writers is a tendency to vacillate, just as Locke does, over whether terms like colour and red denominate physical structures, or the powers that partly result from these structures to cause sensations, or, as Locke usually seems to suppose, the sensations themselves. So you've got tripartite vacillation. You've got, taking colours for example, colours are microphysical structures. Colours are the powers or dispositions that objects have in virtue of their microphysical structures to cause sensations in us, or colours are sensations in us, qualia. There have been defences of these philosophers. Some people think they're more definite in plumping for one solution rather than another than Margaret Wilson thought. But I think everybody ought to recognise the same three candidates in Hume, for example, for virtues. They're useful or agreeable qualities in persons. He says that. Famous passage, temperance, sobriety, patience, constancy, perseverance. These and 1,000 more of the same kind no man will ever deny to be excellences and perfections. They're powers that persons have through possessing such qualities to excite pleasure, love and admiration, or their opposites, in people who are aware of their possession of those virtues. Since every quality in ourselves or others which gives pleasure always causes pride or love, every one that produces uneasiness excites humility or hatred, it follows that these two particulars are to be considered as equivalent with regard to our mental qualities, virtue and the power of producing love or pride, vice and the power of producing humility or hatred. And finally, they're the passions themselves lying in the mind of the person who contemplates these qualities with the right pleasure. Euclid has fully explained every quality of the circle, but has not in any proposition said a word of its beauty. The reason is evident. Beauty is not a quality of the circle. It lies not in any part of the line, etc. It is only the effect which that figure produces upon a mind, whose particular fabric or structure renders it susceptible of such sentiments. So there you get the sentiment. Now, of course, it might seem unpardonable by sort of the standards of analysis or mind or the philosophical review to sit quiet about that tripartite choice. You're going to get your philosophy tutor pointing his bony finger at you and saying, well, come clean. But I don't think it's Hume's question. The vacillation is over a metaphysical question: what colours are, what virtues are, what causes are. I don't think that's Hume's question at all. It's a question that's fit to excite his pyromaniac tendencies. Hume is the philosopher of human nature. His inquiry is entirely concerned with what underlies our experience of virtue or beauty or causation, or our thought or talk about virtue or beauty or causation. And as far as that goes, he needn't be troubled about the vacillation. From his perspective, the tripartite story is quite enough in the way of metaphysics. On the one hand, we have the qualities of character. These are able to excite our love and admiration and esteem and pride, and those feelings gain expression in our moral approval. Were any of the three stages missing, we would not be valuing qualities of character as we do, and we wouldn't have the ethics in recognizable shape that we do. Now, of course, you get the same tripartite structure underneath the philosophy of causation. Causes are temporally prior elements in regular patterns of events. They're the powers such patterns have to prompt inferential dispositions in the contemplating mind. They are the inferential dispositions themselves, or other stances in the mind, such as our dispositions to make practical interventions or to form expectations. And you get the same kind of passage. I won't read passages illustrating all three, but you get, for example, the necessity of any action, whether of matter or of the mind, is not properly a quality in the agent, but in any thinking or intelligent being who may consider the action, and consists in the determination of his thought to infer its existence from some preceding objects. So it's a determination of the mind to make an inference. Again, he's, by contemporary standards, perhaps regrettably relaxed about the metaphysics. And I think it's fair to say that he's equally so about the semantics. There's obviously bound to be an anachronistic element in shoehorning a lot of Hume into our own semantic categories. But I think it's quite proper to argue that one or another view of the meaning of evaluative sentences is the best descendant of his insights. Now, the recent weight of critical opinion seems to have been that the most legitimate or direct heir is a secondary quality theory, thinking of the moral sense as analogous to our sense of colour. But I think there's serious disadvantages in offering Hume any such theory. First of all, Hume does not think that there exists a stable and defensible theory of the way in which our experience of any sensible quality relates to the quality itself. That's the general problem, the relation of our experience of a sensible quality to the quality itself, which leads to the culminating cries of despair at the end of Book 1, Part 4. I think those cries of despair show that the last thing Hume should be happy to do is to model the philosophy of the passions on the catastrophic absence of tenable theory that surrounds the perception of sensible qualities. It'd be like using an Escher drawing as an architectural blueprint. And of course, even if we thought something more positive emerged from Book 1, there'd still be obstacles in the comparison with colour, notably the centrality of passion in the account of the moral experience and aesthetic experience, which is absent in the case of colour. Okay, well, that leads me to think that it's our own state of mind and its expression which takes primary place in locating the semantics of our expressions. I think that the states of mind are the semantic anchorage points of the most general forms of evaluative language. This doesn't mean that Hume confines his attention to thick terms. Indeed, the lists of virtues are just entirely... to thin terms. The lists of virtues are entirely lists given in terms of thick terms. I think it's another bizarre kind of perversion that the last 40 years of moral philosophy have seen, to think that Hume or Humeans have to concentrate on ought and right and good, and are somehow inadequate to cope with courageous and just and loving and all the rest. So I think he thinks the key to understanding the phenomenon of morality, he places it in exactly the same place as do modern expressivists. I think the rest is just detail. Okay, my last point concerns the general point of view in the treatise, or the common point of view in the inquiry concerning the principles of morals. That concept is not entirely easy to fit with any simple idea of voicing our own passions, or voicing our own reactions to things. And indeed, Hume introduces it as such, as in response to two remarkable circumstances in the affair, which may seem objections to the present system. The two, one is the virtue in rags problem, which I shan't talk about. The other is the introduction of the common point of view. We take up the point of view of those who have an intercourse with a person. And it might seem that we leave behind our own sentiments entirely, but confine ourselves to thinking what those would have been had we been in quite a different situation to the one we are actually in which case the idea that it is our own sentiment of approbation or disgust that issues in our applause or condemnation can no longer be true. We issue the verdicts but don't have the sentiments. Hume answers that problem quite confidently in the treatise. But to consider the matter aright, it has no force at all, and it is the easiest matter in the world to account for it. But the analogy he uses, I don't think, quite comes to terms with the problem. What he says is, in like manner, external beauty is determined merely by pleasure, and it is evident a beautiful countenance cannot give so much pleasure when seen at the distance of 20 paces, as when it is brought nearer us. We say not, however, that it appears to us less beautiful, because we know what effect it will have in such a position, and by that reflection we correct its momentary appearance. It is therefore from the influence of characters and qualities upon those who have an intercourse with any person that we praise or blame him. Well, I think that's correct as far as it goes. Hume's perfectly within his rights to privilege some positions. We have to be in the right position to respond to beauty, taste, causation, virtue or vice. If a meal gains applause because when you taste it you find it pleasurable, you can't argue that it fails to deserve this applause because you're not eating it. But what account does Hume have of the verdict when it's unaccompanied by the pleasure? Well, one suggestion would be to rely on the second element. The face is such as to excite, of the three that Margaret Wilson said we vacillate amongst. They vacillate amongst. The face is such as to excite pleasure, but only in subjects well placed to appreciate it. But then that sounds just like an empirical judgment. And then there seems to be a disengagement from actual passion. If we carry that over to the moral case, it would seem that our judgments that some of these characters, such as to serve those closer to him, might be a purely intellectual assessment, disengaged from feeling, and therefore incapable of motivating us. And that would strip moral judgments of their practical identities. Well, I think the solution is that all this is overlooking the role of sympathy in Hume's system. The service done to those others with whom the agent does or did have a close positive relation does excite our sentiment. It excites our sympathetic approval, and thence our praise or blame. In other words, taking up the common point of view is not a matter of leaving passion behind, a matter of having slightly different passions, which arise from that kind of perspective on things. I think this is made especially clear in the second inquiry. While the human heart is compounded of the same elements at present, it will never be wholly indifferent to public good, nor entirely unaffected with the tendency of character and manners. The humanity of one man is the humanity of everyone, and the same object touches the passion in all human creatures. So there's a general kind of plugging in to the common sentiments of mankind, which is going on. I talk a little bit about that in connection with aesthetics, but I think I'll leave that. Just one final thing. We're very familiar with the conception of the web of belief. I think people are much less familiar, and I think this disfigured some of Hare's writings on moral philosophy, with the idea of the web of passion. Hume, by contrast, sees passions as operating upon us in very complicated ways. I'll just give you a couple of examples. We naturally desire what is forbid. This is a lovely reference, if you want it. It's Treatise 2345, Book 2, Part 3, Section 4, Paragraph 5. We naturally desire what is forbid and take a pleasure in performing actions merely because they are unlawful. The notion of duty, when opposite to the passions, is seldom able to overcome them, and when it fails of that effect, is apt rather to increase them by producing an opposition in our motives and principles. So we love being outlaws, and it's enjoyable to be naughty and do what you're not supposed to do, and so on. And again, my sympathy with another may give me the sentiment of pain and disapprobation when any object is presented that has a tendency to give him uneasiness, though I may not be willing to sacrifice anything of my own interest or cross any of my passions for his satisfaction. So, acrasia, weakness of will, wickedness, outright naughtiness, they're all grist to Hume's mill. He does not have a simple sort of monolithic account of motivation, as if when you perceive that something's a duty, everything else goes quiet, and you just sort of, in some Manchurian candidate zombie-like robotic frame of mind, just go and do it. He's far too intelligent to think anything like that. We're contrary beings. There's only a small particle of dove mingled in with the wolf and the serpent. Okay, so the practical nature of morality involves a set of thoughts and feelings. They both emerge from what gives us pain or pleasure, and they provide a new direction, a new set of objects of pain and pleasure, the traits which we despise or hate, and those which we admire and of which we might feel proud. That's the new creation of which Hume talks. It doesn't follow that those pleasures and pains motivate us all the time, although they have their voice heard, sometimes only faintly, in our practical inclinations. And a society in which that's not so could no longer continue to exist, which is enough to ensure the continued public interest in admonishing the villains and shoring up the tottering virtue of the weak. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Simon. So now over to questions.
Perhaps I misunderstood you or misheard you, but at some stage did you say something about John Locke being a rationalist?
Hume thought that Locke, and Locke does have a view of certain principles of morality as discernible by the light of reason alone, a priori knowable. I think it's evident in book 4 of the essay. I can't remember the chapter numbers, but he goes into a very rationalist riff about things, and Hume's concerned to show that all he gets out of pure reason is tautologies. So, for example, it's wrong to behave unjustly, or even perhaps it's wrong to pay no attention to property, or something like that. I think that Locke can only actually derive vacuous moral principles from his a priori reflections. How far rational? I mean, Locke is a tricky writer, and of course there are rationalist elements. If one uses those labels, there are rationalist elements in Locke, in amongst the overt empiricism.
Well, this is something you haven't really touched on, probably because it's not so much a problem for Hume, but for his followers. And that is that some anti-Humeans, so somebody like Scanlon or Quinn, would say that this is a big problem. The problem is the following. Humeans generally endorse the idea that desires or passions are the sort of things that give you good reasons to do things.
I don't think that's true.
Right, okay. You don't think that...
well, I think it's ambiguous, and there's many senses in which it's not true. I mean, take an example I used in a critique of Derek Parfit lately. You and I are walking in the country, and there's a bull in the field. And I say, I think we'd better detour around. Is it my desire not to be gored that's my reason for detouring, or is it the bull in the field? Bad question. It's the bull in the field which I perceive, and given that I've got a general aversion to being gored, or put myself in risk of being gored, I decide to walk around the field.
Okay, well...
But I think I said the desire is the matrix within which the fact of the bull starts to really matter.
Okay, I think I can still ask my question.
Okay, yeah, sure.
I'll use Schroeder's example. And his example is, look, if I want something silly, like, say I want to recreate a catalogue scene on Mars, and the only means for this...
You want to do what?
Say I want to recreate a catalogue scene, a scene from a furniture catalogue.
Oh,
I want to recreate it on Mars. This is
on
what
Mars?
Yes, this is what I want. Okay. And the only means available for this is to build a spacecraft, because nobody will give me the spacecraft to do this, because clearly it's a silly idea.
Right.
So do you think that certainly Schroeder thinks that Humeans are committed, or at least prima facie committed, to saying that I have a reason to build a spacecraft. If you don't think that they're so committed, can you explain why?
I think the locution, I have a reason, or somebody has a reason, is it slips all over the place in these discussions. The person you've described may be motivated to build a spacecraft. He is, of course, mad and very unusual. And what we say about him, go through the roof. But he'll be motivated, yes. Now, of course, I see him as motivated in an entirely foolish way. First of all, he's not going to succeed. Secondly, he'll derive no pleasure from succeeding, and so on and so on. So he's in the grip of a very serious set of illusions about probably himself, the sources of satisfaction, the resources it would take to achieve satisfaction in this direction, all sorts of things. So of course I'll moralise against him until I am old and grey. Well, I suppose I am old and grey, but until I'm older and greyer. And one of the things you might hear me saying is he's got absolutely no reason for doing this. he's a moron, and so on.
So this will be because there is very little chance of success and of deriving pleasure from satisfaction of your desire.
Certainly those things, and of course there's also a huge cost involved, and the diversion of resources, and so on. I mean, until we know more about him, I'm not quite sure how the sermon is going to go, but there'll certainly be a sermon.
Thank you.
Okay. I know what Quinn and Scanlon and people say, and I think it's just false.
So you don't think... Okay, so there are such things as silly passions, and they are silly because... And you think that you can explain, you can exclude them from giving you good reasons by pointing out that you wouldn't get the things that you want, or something like that.
To use Hume's own method, there'd be eventually traits, they'd illustrate traits which are the contrary of being useful or agreeable to ourselves or others. That is, there'd be traits which deserve aversion, hatred, and you ought to feel ashamed of being like that, and so on and so on. There are plenty of those, even without going to Mars. I mean, there are locutions in this area which cause an awful lot of confusion. I mean, take Bernard Williams's character, the confirmed wife-beater, who allegedly is beyond reach by discursive pressures or reasons, giving reasons in the ordinary sense of the word. Can't see any reason not to treat his wife very badly. Is there reason for him to be better? Well, I'd say yes, immediately. That is, he should be better, he ought to be better. Why? Because he's causing his wife distress, and that's pain and so on. So there is reason for him to be better, I can say that. Has he reason to be better? Well, that's ambiguous. It might mean there is reason for him to be better, in which case it's true. It might be questions about his psychology. Does he have a motivation to get better? Well, unfortunately not. It's in the story that he doesn't. Is there a proof, an algorithm proving to him that he should get better? Kant thinks yes, Hume thinks no. Hume's right about it.
Can I continue? Are there...
There's just one person I think so.
Okay, so can I just... So, and your position is privileged over this brutish person because a lot of people would agree with you. To put it crudely.
No, I don't think it's a matter of democratic counting.
No, okay.
And eventually I can get away with saying that we ought to admire the traits of mind which are useful or agreeable to ourselves or others, because I'll get away with saying that because an awful lot of people will share that standard. And if they don't, I'll try and persuade them that it's a very good one.
Thank you.
But if I fail and I'm suddenly surrounded in a society of brutes or misanthropes who think that the qualities to privilege and choose and educate people into qualities of mind that are useless and disagreeable, like greed, say, Mrs. Thatcher's favourite virtue, then they're wrong. I'm not going to change my mind because I'm surrounded by brutes and apes and things. Conservatives, Tories.
A couple of points. One, thank you very much. So 3 points. That was the first one. The second one is by way of just backing up what you said about Kenny and the relationship and some of that strand of thinking with Murdoch. It was her stuff about attention she got from Simone Weil.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's a deeply laden concept for her.
Yes.
I mean, it's something you strive towards, not something that's an evident quality or category.
Yeah.
And that's what I think it got distorted in the way down the system. But that's just a comment. But good. The question, I'd love you to say a bit more about matrix. It's a terrific metaphor. It's as with great metaphors, it's dangerous. I mean, I remember moving into an organisation where they said proudly, we've got matrix management here, which was a way of telling me not to try and lay down the law, actually. But it means there are no lines, single lines of authority, and those single sources in which decisions are made.
Yes.
And the responsibilities of people are not singular and linear. And that could apply to what Hume conceives as the human being.
Yes.
But I just wonder if you'd say a little bit more.
Yes, well, let's see, we've got the web of belief.
Yeah.
I think the idea of a matrix appealed to me. I haven't seen this metaphor much explored or used. Partly because it's got something of the same image as the web, obviously in a mathematical matrix, it's just a web of numbers. But also, of course, it's something like a pudding, you know, or the suet that, you know, with the raisins stuck in it. And I think that actually, when you're thinking about the interpretation of human beings, often our passions, desires, and intentions even are something more like a pudding than they are, you know, a grid or a web with nodes which are identifiable. I mean, we explain by invoking intentions, for example, but often we only seem to know what we intend when we find what we do. So it's a question of reading back and reinterpreting and so on. And I think what I wanted to bring into the metaphor, for good or ill, was this sense that there's a certain formlessness about psychological explanation. It's not entirely formless. There are psychological explanations which are false and the ones which are better than others and so on. But the hermeneutic project, as people would say, in other words, the project of interpretation, is not as simple as the project of finding which atoms of psychology are present and numbering them off. I think that's the bit that was resonating in my mind.
It certainly appeals to me because it is trying to draw distinctions between human beings and machines in one way or another.
Yes,
and in terms of the causal lives you would expect to see operating in machines. Yeah. And although it's a soft way of saying it, it seems to preserve and capture something that you lose if you go to the other metaphor of machine. Which is a metaphor.
Yes, which is itself a metaphor, of course, exactly. Yes, I mean, it's insisting on there being potentially differences between the nature of psychological interpretation and explanation, and vindication sometimes, and mechanical explanations. I mean, obviously people like Davidson explored this, so I'm not saying anything terribly radical here, but
this is sort of picking up on formlessness and on sort of Margaret Wilson's point about vacillation.
Sure.
And it's not clear. I mean, just if you enumerate, you know, those three topics, that it is in fact a vacillation, and you know, you could be talking about a sort of systematic interrelatedness that, in the manner that you know the phenomenologists investigate.
Right. So did you say it is a vacillation or it isn't?
Well, it's not clear that whether it is or it isn't.
Yes. Okay. Good.
And you know, but Hume temperamentally wouldn't have done that because he obviously just is very discursive and you know, and you know, his writing style and you know, his sentences aren't predestined to end anywhere. So. And so, I mean, do you think that, you know, a Humean sort of project could be given more form? Or would it make it, you know, un-Humean, or is there anything?
Well, one can certainly choose to, I mean, I would choose, as I sort of hinted, I suppose, to emphasize very much as what I call the semantic anchorage, the third element in each of the options, if you will. It's not that you forget the first two, but they're there because of the third in a very important way. at least as far as the science of human nature goes. Yes. No, well, I mean, I think after that you can precisify, that is, you could have a more precise semantics for causal judgments, or a more precise psychology, as Helen was telling us this afternoon. So I think there's certainly room for further work. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering what you thought of Hume, since we heard about Hume's contribution to psychology in the field of causation and our experience thereof earlier. I wondered what you thought of Hume's possible contribution to empirical moral psychology. I'm thinking specifically about research on how we come to decisions. For example, Damasio's hypothesis that feelings are intimately involved in any intentions that we reach, or in the more moral psychology field, work by Jonathan Haidt and others on affect-driven moral decisions which are then rationalized post hoc. Assuming this kind of research, these kinds of results are sound, and of course in some cases there is doubt that they are, but assuming they're sound, do you think that would vindicate Hume's approach to practical reason over the rationalist philosophers, or is that entirely the wrong question to ask?
It's not the wrong question to ask, and thank you for asking it. I mean, when I wrote Ruling Passions, I was quite, in fact, I've got a section in that book, that was in 1998, on Damasio's interpretation of emotions. It's a little tricky. I think it's trickier than I thought then. First of all, of course, there are different interpretations of what what's the PVM, patients with the prefrontal ventromedial cortex messed up, exactly what they've lost. Damasio thought they'd lost the capacity to generate in a stable way, attach affect to projected outcomes of choices. So a gamble wouldn't appear a bad gamble long enough for the gambler to make sensible choices and decisions if he's got one of these lesions. Phineas Gage couldn't live a normal life after the accident and so on, because his emotions were unstable, basically. It's not that he lost affect. Damasio actually sometimes wrote as if he'd lost affect. But in fact, he went around cussing and swearing and, generally being a nuisance. So I think he had affect all right. He just didn't control it by being able to present certain upshots to himself as bad. And couldn't attach the aversion to those upshots in a stable way. And that would be a very Humean way of talking about the deficit. Other people have said, no, it's a failure of the possible power of imagination. He can't conceive of himself as extended through time in the right way. So there's a different kind of loss, which shows us the different difficulty of interpretation here. Part of the danger in relying on empirical psychology, especially when it comes to, for example, fMRI scans, is that they're good, of course. I mean, what they're good at is picking up, if they're good at anything, which is slightly controversial, is picking up excitation in particular parts of the brain and so on. You then got to interpret it, and there's going to be a question of whether you interpret the excitation as, for example, an emotion or as something else. And I think people are apt to be quite simplistic about whether brainwriting is any easier to interpret than human beings' doings. And of course, ultimately, it's always got to be calibrated against human beings and their doings and our interpretations of the whole animal. So I'm a little hands-off about that. Haidt himself and Simone Schnall and their co-workers, they're very good at telling us about the causal impact of things which we mightn't have understood were causally impacting on us. So, for example, in a if you remember nothing else I say, this is the lesson to take away from this meeting. If you or anyone you love get into the position of being defendant in a court of law, bribe the cleaners to clean the jury room. Because there's considerable robust evidence that being put into a slightly distasteful environment makes people's judgments harsher. Anything that's been checked both in reality and in experimental setups. So pay what you can to make the jury room clean. So that's a purely, I mean, no juror in his right mind thinks, oh, this is a dirty jury room, so I better give him an extra year in judge. It works via a purely causal process, obviously on your mood, basically. And heightened people are very good at pointing out that kind of thing. I think it's a wild generalization to go from those very interesting results, as you hear, I love them. But I think it's a slightly wild generalization to go from those to say that all conscious ratiocination is kind of epiphenomenal, or is after the fact, or decisions are already made. I just don't think that's true. I think if it were true, we would evolve not to talk to each other as much.
Thank you.
My next question may also be based on incorrectly interpreting what you said, but did I hear you say that you felt it was wrong to dismiss people or groups of people as irrational because you put them outside the conversation? Did I hear that correctly?
Well, yes, it was perhaps not as simple as that. I don't want to say the word always immediately carries that implication, but I think it hovers in the background. I mean, it's a professional defamation. There's nothing a philosopher likes more than to find that his opponent is irrational. So, this guy goes around wanting to put radios on whenever he finds them. He's irrational. No, he's not. He's just somebody who likes to have noise around him. It seems to me shoehorning all vices under the umbrella of, mixed metaphor, putting all vices under the umbrella term of irrational is, I think, a dangerous thing to do. Can be dangerous because it can be a way of signalling that you're no longer in the conversation.
Now, my question is, to follow that up, is that perhaps this doesn't really fit in with the examples you give. There's somebody like Richard Dawkins, who says that theists, well, if he doesn't say it, he certainly implies are irrational.
Yeah, right.
Now, would that fit in with what you were saying, or would you put that in a different category?
It would fit in with what I say, and I think part of the reason why Dawkins is more of a nuisance to atheists and secularists like myself than he is to Christians is exactly that he breathes this spirit of contempt, and the idea that anybody Christian or religious in any way is outside the pale of human rationality. It's a very, very bad thing to tell people. It's a very bad thing to think about people. I mean, that's quite apart from Dawkins's philosophy of religion, which is, not really halfway through chapter 1. I mean, if you read the dialogues, he'd do much better.
Mike.
Simon, I've just got a question going back to reasons again, and the rationalists versus the Humeans. I was just thinking there's this nice example Hampshire gives in his review of Scanlon's book. And he says, well, suppose I come across the work of a really mediocre 18th century painter. Very recognised that it's mediocre, but I kind of fall in love with the works, and I devote my time to finding and seeking out these really rather petty and ordinary works. Then Hampshire said, well, it looks like, what's my reason for going to the gallery this week or whatever it's to see the works of this person. So I seem to have reasons in relation here. But ultimately, we want to explain my reasons in this case in terms of an affective state, my desire or my love of these things. So he took that to be a possible challenge to Scamber. And I just had a couple of thoughts about that. One, I mean, I take it the response that Derek would give to that, I haven't talked to Tim about it, is, well, of course you have a reason to indulge your own whims, rather than the way that parents have reasons to indulge the arbitrary desires of children. So that's the real reason. That seems to me a misdescription of the case. So that seems to me inappropriate. So it seems to me that this is a real kind of challenge to the rationalists. But at least as the debate is sometimes set up, it seems to me it's a challenge to both sides of that debate, because the example that Hampshire raises is one for which there are clear contrast cases. Cases where one wouldn't wish to appeal to an affective state or let's say an idiosyncratic affective state or love as the ground of that reason. And so it looks like there's a contrast that we want to draw among our reasons, some of which seem to be based in us and some of which don't. Now, I don't, in itself, I think that's any challenge to the Humean or necessarily to the rationalists, but it is a problem for the way in which the debate seems to have developed over the last 20 years, because as Tim sets it up, as Parfit set it up in his paper on reasons, makes it look as if either reasons are all out there or they're all in here. Whereas, as Hampshire I think quite rightly points out, actually our ordinary division put some cases of reasons inside and some out.
I think I'd thank you, Mike, that's very helpful. And anything that helps diagnose what I call the fog that seems to have beset the profession would be helpful. I think it's true, I mean, and this also is true of Quinn's examples, for example, that, as it were, the role that passions, temperament, pleasures, things like that, the role they play becomes much more visible when you've got idiosyncratic ones, strange ones. And then, of course, we get rather nervous too about why is this chap like he is, because it's not normal, not that, what we think of as natural. So somebody really, I mean, Andrew Lloyd Webber collects some dreadful pre-Raphaelite paintings. He collected some good ones actually, but also some dreadful ones. And,
I know what she's looking at when he composes that piece.
Yes, I mean, perhaps he just had a taste for the silly and the sentimental. Perish the thought. Yes, I mean, when somebody's really got a quirky sort of taste, or an idiosyncratic taste, it's very visible, and we're inclined to think that's a very different case from normal. But that might just be because the passion or desire is unusual. So, for example, going back to the context I gave, the example I gave, you know, most members of Ramblers clubs would prefer not to go across a field with a bull in it, and they go around the side or find another route or something. It's a very natural thing, so it just seems like an exercise of reason. What's the reasonable thing to do here? Oh, we go around the field. Goes without saying, as you might say. But of course, that doesn't at all impugn a more thoroughgoing Humean story about the matrix within which the bull has got that effect, which is via an aversion, as he would see it, to pain or death or destruction or whatever, which human beings very widely share and implement. But you don't have to, as it were, it's a bit like, you know, people used in the philosophy of science to make a great fuss about whether it's part of the explanation of, you know, why Stuart's twiddling his fingers, that there's oxygen in the room. And you say, well, okay,
Long way out.
it's a long way out. I mean, it's not wrong to include it in those contexts of the equivalent of the anatomist, the physicist, in which it certainly ought to be included. But of course, 99.999% of our interests go on without us ever thinking about it as a causally interesting feature.
I mean,
it's a bit like
yeah.
that.
I mean, I didn't mean to suggest that the contrast in the Hampshire was at all a problem for the Humean.
No, I know.
But I mean, I do think it locates the potential area of disagreement very differently from how a lot of the debate now goes, because I quite see that the kind of Humeanism you're attracted to will want to draw a contrast between what's uniform among us and what's idiosyncratic, as explaining the shift of focus between us and the world. But it's not at all clear that that is the way in which we understand that contrast. So one could see a possible kind of rationalist who wanted to understand that contrast as seeing some things the world requires of us, some things we require of the world, and that's a contrast among our reasons. But that option for a rationalist seems to be ruled out in the current way in which Parfit and Scanlon, for example, are both trying to set the issues up, in which it's got to be all or nothing, because it seems to me there's two separate questions. There's whether requirements could be imposed on you by the world just per se, and leaving open that there might be other things. And the opposition of that is the thought that no, there must always be a distinctive internal factor, but that may be universal, versus a view, no, the very idea of a reason involves something entirely independent of us.
Well, I think the nearest I would get to saying that the very idea of a reason of a practical reason is eventually going to involve the personal element. I'm not sure I like in us and locutions like that very much, but anyway, a fact about the person as opposed to the world, as far as there's a division, would be the Bennett stuff that you're going to need if you're indulging in intentional explanation at all. Some kind of bifurcation between goals and registrations, as he puts it, or between intentions and desires on the one hand and perceptions on the other. And that's not an idiosyncrasy of 18th century psychology. It's, if Bennett's right, it's as a very integral to the structure of psychological explanation itself. So that would be the reason for saying that the pure Parfit or Nagel or Scanlon idea of requirements sitting there as requirements, as of right, as it were, regardless of the passionate nature, the psychology of the agent, is bound to be fallacious. It's bound to be, at best, an exaggeration of our direction of attention.
Yes, but that's why the intermediate position is then interesting, I think.
Well, as long as the intermediate position doesn't say they're sometimes right, and the Humean is sometimes right.
Yeah, no, that's
no,
not.
But that wouldn't be the intermediacy, no.
Okay, well, before we thank Simon again, I should first mention that if you head off in this direction, you'll find some wine. Thanks to everybody for coming. Thanks as well to everybody at the Institute who's been involved in organising the day, Helen and Shara and everyone else, and to all the speakers. But let's end by just saying thanks again to Simon.